On a freezing Minnesota night, retired Army veteran Frank Miller heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind. 3 tiny scratches at his door, followed by a whimper so thin it could have snapped in the cold. When Frank Miller opened up, 3 German Shepherd puppies sat on his porch, shaking like fallen leaves, eyes begging for one thing: shelter. Frank Miller pulled the 3 puppies inside, wrapped the 3 puppies in warmth, and told the storm, not tonight. But by sunrise, the silence around Frank Miller's cabin was gone. Sirens tore through the pine trees. Red and blue lights painted the snow. Deputies fanned across the yard, shouting commands like the woods had turned into a battlefield. And Frank Miller, who had spent a lifetime outrunning surprises, stood at his own door like a man being accused by the dawn. People in town would later whisper, "Why would police surround a veteran's cabin? What did those 3 puppies bring out of the blizzard?" Because the truth wasn't just about rescue. It was about a trail in the snow, a secret under the porch, and a danger that had been closer than Frank Miller ever guessed. Stay with this story to the end, because the smallest footprints sometimes lead to the darkest answers. And before we begin, hit like, share, and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. 3 eyes in the blizzard. Snow came down in thick, quiet sheets over Duluth, Minnesota, and the wind worried the pines like an old siren that refused to forget how to scream. Frank Miller stood at his kitchen window and watched the world erase itself. The yard, the fence line, the narrow track that passed for a road, everything softened into one long, white breath. The glass was cold enough to sting his knuckles, but he kept his hand there anyway, as if pain could anchor him. 65 and still built like a man who had once carried too much weight for too long, Frank had the squared shoulders of a younger soldier and the tired posture of an older one. His hair had gone the color of ash, cut short out of habit, not fashion. A close, neatly trimmed beard framed a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, the kind of face that didn't offer smiles easily, but could hold a promise like a vow. His skin was pale from winter and the long indoor days, weathered at the cheekbones and around the eyes, lines that weren't only age, but nights. People in town called him Sir without knowing why. He spoke politely when spoken to, but he didn't linger. He tipped well at the grocery store and always returned the cart. He'd learned long ago that kindness could be efficient, even when warmth felt expensive. He lived alone in a small log cabin at the edge of the forest, just far enough from neighbors that nobody dropped by just because. That distance wasn't an accident. It was an agreement he'd made with himself after the military. An unwritten treaty. Less noise, fewer questions, no surprises. Surprises were the kind of thing that used to arrive in metal and fire. Inside, his home smelled like pine wood and black coffee. A cast-iron stove ticked softly as it cooled between feedings. A pair of boots, scarred, heavy, faithful, sat by the door like obedient guards. On the wall near the hallway hung a faded photograph of a younger Frank, in uniform, beside a grinning group of men. Their smiles looked too bright for the world they had belonged to. Frank didn't display it for nostalgia. He kept it there the way sailors kept a compass, not because it was comforting, but because it was true. He turned away from the window and moved through the kitchen with a measured quiet. His body remembered the rules of late night. No wasted motion, no slamming cabinets, no unnecessary light. He poured coffee into a chipped mug that said, "World's okayest dad," a gift from a life that had moved on without him. He wasn't bitter about it. Bitterness was loud. Frank preferred silence. Then the sound came. It wasn't the wind. He knew the wind's voice, the way it moaned through cracks and slapped the siding like an impatient hand. This was smaller, sharper. A scratch, then another, as if something delicate was trying to write its name into the wood. Frank froze with the mug halfway to his mouth. He listened again, and there it was. 3 faint taps of claws, followed by a thin whine that wobbled like a thread about to snap. The sound didn't belong to the forest's usual visitors. Coyotes had confidence. Raccoons had attitude. This was different. This was pleading. His first instinct was caution, the old training rising up like a reflex. You didn't open doors blindly. You didn't assume the night was empty just because it looked empty. In war, the most dangerous thing was what you couldn't see. But winter wasn't a battlefield, and desperation was a language Frank could translate without thinking. He set the mug down and reached for his coat, a thick brown canvas jacket that still carried the shape of his shoulders. He slid on gloves and took the flashlight from the hook beside the door. The beam clicked on with a clean white line, slicing through the dim room. Frank unlocked the deadbolt, cracked the door a few inches, and the cold lunged inside like a living creature. It stole his breath and filled his lungs with needles. Snow swirled at his boots in little spirals, as if the storm were eager to enter too. He lowered the flashlight. 3 small shapes huddled on the porch boards. Puppies. German Shepherd puppies, and not the modern sloped-back kind people posted online for likes. These were traditional, straight-backed even as babies, with broad little paws that promised they'd grow into their bodies. Their coats were thick and dark, a mix of black and tan, dusted with snow like powdered sugar on bread that didn't deserve sweetness. The biggest pup sat in the front as if trying to be brave. His ears were half up, half flopped, undecided about the world. His eyes were a deep brown, wide and watchful, the way a child watches a stranger's hands. A faint scar-like crease crossed the bridge of his nose, maybe from rough play, maybe from a rougher life. He trembled, but he didn't retreat. To his left, the smallest pup was shaking so hard her entire body quivered. She had a lighter tan around the muzzle, a soft mask that made her look permanently worried. Her whine came out as a tiny sound that barely fought the wind. She pressed her side into the others like a question. Are we safe yet? The third pup, in the middle, had the calmest face of the 3. A rounder head and a black stripe down the forehead like a painted blessing. He blinked slowly at Frank, and for a heartbeat, his eyes looked too old for his age. Like he'd already learned that kindness was rare and should be memorized when found. Frank crouched, careful not to loom. His knees protested. He ignored it. The porch boards were slick with ice, and he placed one gloved hand flat on the wood for balance. "Hey," he said softly, as if speaking too loudly might shatter them. The wind tugged at his coat. Snow stung his cheeks. The puppies didn't move. Their bodies were rigid with cold and fear, but their noses lifted, sniffing, deciding. Frank noticed their ribs under the thick fur. He noticed the way their paws were pink at the pads, raw from ice. He noticed the snow clinging to their whiskers like tiny white flags of surrender. He also noticed something else. No collar. No leash. No human footprints leading away. Only scattered paw marks that looked like the last line of a story written in panic. His mind offered questions the way it always did. Where's the mother? How long have they been out here? Why my porch? But another part of him, older than training and stronger than logic, gave the only answer that mattered. If he closed the door, they would not make it. Frank extended his hand, palm down, letting them smell the glove. The middle pup leaned forward first, pressing his nose to the leather. The smallest pup followed, timidly, as if the world might punish her for hope. The biggest one watched Frank's face, reading him the way soldiers read new terrain, then took a small step closer. Frank exhaled slowly. The breath fogged in front of him like a ghost. "All right," he murmured, and something in his voice carried a command he used to give men, not animals. "We're doing this." He slid one arm under the biggest pup and another under the middle one, then gently gathered the smallest against his chest. They were lighter than he expected, like bundles of cold laundry, like fragile promises. Their hearts hammered fast against his ribs. The smallest pup let out a shaky sigh, and it sounded almost like relief. Frank stood and turned sideways to block the wind, carrying them across the threshold. The warmth from the cabin met them instantly, and all three blinked as if light itself had changed texture. He kicked the door shut with his boot and locked it without looking, his hands still full. Habit. Always habit. He laid them down near the stove on an old wool blanket he used for muddy boots. He didn't care about the blanket anymore. He grabbed a thicker quilt from the couch, a patchwork thing, too cheerful for his house, and covered them carefully, tucking the corners like he remembered someone once doing for him, long ago, before he learned to pretend he didn't need it. The puppies pressed together under the quilt, a three-headed knot of trembling life. Frank sat back on his heels and stared at them. In the hush of the cabin, he could hear their breathing, thin, uneven, but there. He could hear the stove's quiet tick. He could hear the storm outside, furious and powerless against four walls and one stubborn man. A strange ache climbed into Frank's throat, sharp as the cold that had tried to follow him in. He swallowed it down, as he always did, but his eyes stayed on the puppies. He spoke again, low and certain, the way a man speaks when he's promising something to himself as much as to anyone else. "In this house," Frank said, "you're safe." And for the first time that night, the wind outside sounded less like a siren and more like distance. A soldier's instinct, a puppy's alarm. Morning arrived like an apology. The storm loosened its grip and left the world glittering. Snow piled in soft drifts, branches bent low, the sky pale as old paper. Duluth looked harmless again, the way a lake can look calm right before it swallows someone. Inside the cabin, Frank Miller woke in his chair with a stiff neck and a quiet ache behind his eyes. The fire had burned down to a red, patient glow. His coffee cup sat untouched on the table like a witness who refused to testify. The three German Shepherd puppies were no longer trembling in fear, but they weren't relaxed either. They lay in a tight cluster near the stove, their bodies warmed through, their paws tucked under them. The biggest one, still the self-appointed guard, lifted his head as soon as Frank moved. His ears twitched toward every small sound, the settling wood, the faint groan of the roof, the wind's last sigh. Frank rubbed his beard and watched them. In the clean light of morning, they looked even younger than they had in the doorway. Barely weaned, maybe 8 weeks at most. Too young to be brave. Too young to be alone. And yet, the middle pup stood and padded toward the back door as if he had a job to do. He sniffed the crack beneath the doorframe, nose working fast, then let out a thin, urgent bark that didn't sound playful at all. The smallest pup followed, tail held stiff like a flag in a storm. She circled once, twice, then added her own sharp yip, high-pitched, panicked, as though the air itself carried a warning. Frank straightened slowly. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in ghosts, but he believed in patterns. He believed in trained senses. He believed that animals heard the notes humans missed. "Easy," he murmured, softening his voice the way he used to with new recruits who tried too hard to look fearless. "What is it?" The biggest pup moved between Frank and the door, broad paws planted as if he could physically stop danger from entering. He let out a small growl, low, vibrating, not at Frank, but at whatever lived beyond the wood. The sound raised a line of cold along Frank's spine. He crossed the room and checked the deadbolt first, then the chain. His fingers didn't fumble. They never fumbled when things mattered. On the wall by the door, a small rack held his old hunting cap and a set of keys. Next to it hung a simple framed certificate from the VA clinic in town, the kind that said in formal letters that a person had survived and therefore deserved a paper proving it. Frank reached for the flashlight again, clicked it on, and angled the beam toward the bottom edge of the door. Nothing. Just light and wood and a thin black line of winter. Then he listened. Not the wind, not the cabin. Outside, far off, something shifted. An almost inaudible crunch that could have been a branch dropping snow, or a boot finding purchase. Frank's jaw tightened. He moved with the careful calm of someone who had learned that panic was loud, and loud got you hurt. He didn't open the door. Instead, he went to the kitchen window and pulled the curtain back a sliver. The yard lay blanketed in white. The pines stood like dark sentries. For a moment, there was nothing but beauty. Then he saw it. A line in the snow. Not a clean footprint trail, not the neat pattern of paws, but a disturbed path that looked dragged, as if something heavy had been pulled across the yard. It ran from the tree line to the side of his porch, then disappeared beneath the shadow of the cabin. Frank's mouth went dry. The puppies barked again, frantic now, bouncing from door to window like tiny alarms on four legs. The smallest pup scratched at the back door with a desperation that made her nails click against the wood. Frank didn't scold her. He set the flashlight down and pulled on his boots, the same pair that had walked him through deserts and hospital hallways and every quiet morning after. He shrugged into his canvas coat. The movement was automatic. Muscle memory stitched him back into the old shape of himself. He took one slow breath and opened the back door just enough to feel the cold. The puppies surged forward, but Frank blocked them with his leg, gentle but firm. "No," he said, not harshly, commandingly. "Stay." The biggest pup whined, offended, like a young soldier told to hold position when every nerve screamed to advance. Frank stepped outside alone. The air was knife-sharp, clean enough to hurt. Snow squeaked under his boots. He kept his shoulders loose and his gaze wide, scanning tree to tree, shadow to shadow. His cabin sat in a shallow clearing. Beyond it, the forest thickened and swallowed light. He followed the disturbed path with his eyes. Near the porch, the drag marks darkened slightly, as if whatever had been pulled had leaked warmth into the snow. Frank crouched and touched the surface with a gloved finger. The snow there wasn't just disturbed. There was a faint stain, diluted pink, like the memory of blood. His stomach tightened. Somewhere in his mind, an old scene tried to rise. Dust, shouting, the metallic smell that never truly left a man's nose. Frank pushed it down. He was here. He was now. This was a cabin in Minnesota, not a foreign street. Still, blood was blood. He stood and looked toward the trees again. No movement, no sound. Just the whisper of branches and the far, patient lake. Frank returned inside, shut the door, and locked it. The puppies rushed him, sniffing his boots, then backed away, unsettled by what they smelled. The middle pup sneezed hard, then barked sharply at the window again, like he wanted Frank to understand. "This is real. This is close." "All right," Frank muttered. "All right, I hear you." He had no phone line out here, just a spotty cell signal that came and went like a fickle visitor. He picked up his phone anyway and walked toward the front window. One bar, then two, then none. He exhaled through his nose, humorless. Of course. So he did what he always did when systems failed. He made his own. He checked every latch. He pulled the curtains. He kept the puppies in the warm center of the cabin, away from windows. He filled a bowl with water and tore pieces of leftover roast into a plate. The puppies ate like they were afraid the food might vanish if they blinked. Frank watched them while pretending not to. The biggest pup kept looking up between bites, eyes locked on Frank's face, measuring him, trusting him, claiming him. The smallest pup, once she'd eaten, curled against Frank's boot like it was the safest object in existence. The middle pup sat alert, head tilted, ears twitching at sounds no one else could hear. By dusk, the sky bruised purple over the trees. Frank stood at the living room window with one hand on the curtain, ready to close it. The cabin felt too quiet, the way it does before a thunderclap. The puppies hovered behind him, their bodies tense, tails low. Then it came. 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. Not the frantic pounding of someone lost. Not the friendly tap of a neighbor. These were deliberate, each strike spaced as if whoever stood outside wanted to be counted. 1, 2, 3. The puppies erupted, sharp barking, teeth bared, tiny bodies bristling with impossible courage. The biggest pup threw himself toward the door, a miniature guardian with a lion's heart. Frank didn't move. He didn't call out. He didn't open. Silence, he knew, could be armor. He turned off the nearest lamp. The room darkened, leaving only the low glow from the stove. He guided the puppies back with his hands. Steady, gentle pressure. Then motioned them toward the hallway. "Quiet," he whispered. "With me." He picked up the flashlight again and clicked it on without aiming it at the door. Light could give away position. Another old lesson. He stepped into the corner beside the fireplace, where the wall gave him cover and the room stayed in his full view. He listened. The wind held its breath. The cabin creaked once. Outside, nothing moved. At least, nothing that wanted to be heard. Frank's heart beat slow and hard, like a drum that refused to panic. The puppies pressed against his legs, trembling not with cold this time, but with raw instinct. And in the thick, watchful darkness, Frank realized something he hadn't allowed himself to think yet. Those puppies hadn't just found warmth. They had found shelter. From something. Sirens at dawn. Secrets under the porch. Dawn did not arrive gently. It arrived on an engine's roar. Frank had not slept so much as he had waited, sitting in that same corner by the fireplace, flashlight in his hand, breath measured, ears tuned to every complaint of the cabin. Sometime after the 3 slow knocks, the night had returned to pretending it was empty. The puppies finally dozed in a tight heap at his feet, twitching as if they were chasing bad dreams through snow. Frank stayed upright anyway, because a soldier learns early that the body can rest without permission, but the mind never signs the paperwork. The first hint of morning was a thin gray smear on the window. The second was the sound. A sharp, mechanical wail cutting straight through the trees. Siren. Then another. Then the crunch of tires fighting drifts, the low growl of multiple vehicles pushing up the narrow access track like a pack. The puppies snapped awake as one. The biggest pup launched to his feet, hackles lifting along his spine, his bark suddenly deeper than it had any right to be. The smallest pup skittered backward, then darted forward again, trapped between fear and loyalty. The middle pup went straight to the front door and pressed his nose to the crack, drawing in air like he could read the entire world through scent alone. Frank stood slowly. Stiff joints protested. He ignored them. He crossed to the window and pulled the curtain back a single inch. Red and blue lights strobed through the trees, painting the snow in frantic color. 4 vehicles at least, 2 marked county units and a pair of SUVs with roof lights. Figures moved in heavy winter gear, their shapes bulky, their breath fogging. A voice carried through a megaphone, amplified into something too official for the quiet woods. "Occupant of the residence, remain inside. Come to the door slowly when instructed." Frank's mouth went dry. Not from fear exactly. Fear had different flavors, but from the sudden, unreal shift of his life. For years he had chosen this distance, this silence. Now the world had driven into his yard with sirens and commands, as if his cabin had been rewritten as a crime scene. He looked down at the puppies. 3 pairs of eyes stared back, bright and trembling with purpose. They didn't understand uniforms, but they understood threat. Frank crouched and placed both hands lightly on their backs, steadying them with touch the way he once steadied frightened men with a calm look. "Stay behind me," he murmured, as if they were a squad and not 3 furred infants. "No hero stuff." He approached the door, kept his body angled, and opened it only after unhooking the chain and keeping the deadbolt half engaged. A slice of cold air knifed inside. Outside, officers stood in a loose semicircle, spaced apart, boots planted wide in the snow. Their posture wasn't panicked, but it was ready. The kind of readiness that assumed danger could erupt from anything with hinges. At the center of them stood Sheriff Jake Thompson. He was tall, broad through the chest, the type of man who looked like he'd been carved from winter. His face was squared and blunt, with a short, dark beard peppered with gray and eyebrows that pulled together as if they lived in permanent concern. He wore a heavy parka with a gold star patch, and he carried himself with the steady authority of someone who'd seen what happens when people hesitate. His eyes, however, were not cruel. They were sharp, like a man who hated wasting time but didn't enjoy frightening anyone. "Sir," Thompson called, voice firm but not loud. "Open the door fully and step out where we can see your hands." Frank could have bristled at the command. He didn't. He'd heard worse. He unlatched the rest of the locks and opened the door wide. The puppies surged to his ankles, growling in tiny, furious pulses. Frank blocked them gently with his leg and stepped onto the porch, hands open at chest level, palms out. "I'm unarmed," Frank said. His voice came out even, almost flat. The calm wasn't a performance. It was a reflex. A younger deputy to the sheriff's left shifted her stance. Deputy Sarah Collins had a lean, athletic build, the kind earned from long nights and hard training, rather than a gym mirror. She was in her early 30s, skin pale from winter and duty, freckles faint across her nose. Her hair, dark blonde, was pulled back in a tight ponytail under a knit cap, and her eyes were a clear, alert blue that didn't miss details. She didn't fidget. She didn't posture. But her right hand hovered near her holster the way a pianist's fingers hover over keys, ready to play the moment a note is wrong. There was a tired steadiness in her expression, as if the job had taught her to keep her feelings folded up and pocketed until later. A thin scar traced the edge of her chin, an old reminder that people could turn without warning. "Mr. Miller?" Sheriff Thompson asked. "You live here alone?" Frank nodded. "Just me." Sarah's gaze dropped, and she noticed the puppies immediately. Her eyes narrowed. Interest, recognition, concern all at once. Thompson followed her line of sight. "Those dogs, are those yours?" Frank's answer came with a brief, surprising softness. "Found 'em last night. 3 German Shepherd pups. Nearly froze on my porch." A ripple passed through the semicircle. One officer lifted a radio and spoke quietly into it. Another turned his head toward the trees as if the forest might reply. Sarah stepped closer, careful not to startle the puppies, and crouched slightly. "How long were they out there?" she asked. Her voice was gentler than her posture suggested. "I don't know," Frank said, "but they came to my door like they were running from something." At that, Thompson's jaw tightened. "Did anyone else come to your door overnight?" he asked. "Any knocking? Any voices?" Frank hesitated only a moment. He didn't like being the center of attention. He liked it even less when attention wore badges. But hiding details was never a good idea when the cold truth already existed outside. "There were knocks," Frank admitted. 3. Slow. Same pattern. He felt his own words settle heavy in the air. No voice. I didn't open. Sarah's eyes flicked to Thompson. A quick, sharp glance, silent communication. Thompson nodded once, small and grim. "We're searching for an armed robbery suspect," Thompson said, voice lowered, as if the trees might eavesdrop. "He was wounded during the incident in town. Last known direction was into these woods. We picked up traces on the North Trail, signs he may have approached this area." Frank's chest tightened. "I saw drag marks near the porch this morning," he said. "And a faint pink stain in the snow." Sarah's expression hardened. "Blood," she murmured, more to herself than to Frank. The puppies suddenly exploded into barking again. The middle pup, calmest until now, darted to the far corner of the porch and began scratching furiously at a spot near the railing, claws chipping ice from wood. The biggest pup joined him, pawing, nose pressed low, whining as if trying to pull the truth out of the boards. The smallest pup circled them, yipping, her entire body vibrating with urgency. Sarah rose. "Sheriff," she said sharply, "look at that." Thompson stepped forward, boots crunching. One of the other deputies, an older man with a round red nose and tired eyes, clearly a veteran of winter patrols, moved in with a small pry tool from his belt. He wedged it under a loose plank and, with a grunt, lifted. Snow slid off the board. Underneath was darkness. And something darker. A strip of fabric, crumpled and stiff, stained deep red. Next to it, half buried in frost, a small metal key fob glinted dully. Sarah picked it up carefully with a gloved hand. There were letters scratched into it, initials, simple and careless, like something someone carried every day without thinking. R.K. Frank's stomach dropped. The pieces clicked into place with the cruel neatness of a trap. The puppies hadn't stumbled onto his porch by chance. They had arrived like messengers, small, trembling heralds dragging a secret behind them. Thompson straightened, eyes scanning the tree line again. "Lock this area down," he ordered into his radio. "No one moves without my say." Sarah looked at Frank, her blue eyes steady. "Mr. Miller," she said, "you did the right thing not opening that door." Frank didn't answer right away. His gaze fell to the 3 puppies, still circling the exposed space under the porch boards, whining as if they'd been carrying this burden all night. He felt something shift inside him. Not panic, not even fear, but the cold clarity of understanding. He had brought them in to save their lives, and somehow, in doing so, he had opened his home to the shadow of someone else's violence. Into the white, the wire-tight moment. They moved like a strange little convoy, badges, boots, breath, and 3 pups with snow on their whiskers, threading into the forest as if the trees had opened a narrow mouth and invited them in. Sheriff Jake Thompson gave quick, clipped instructions that did not waste syllables. He placed deputies wide enough apart to watch the flanks and close enough that no one vanished between trunks. The wind kept tugging at his parka and trying to steal his words, but Thompson's voice held steady anyway, the way some men's voices did when responsibility was heavier than weather. Deputy Sarah Collins stayed near the front, eyes scanning low and high, the muzzle of her flashlight slicing through drifting snow. Her cheeks were already pink from cold, and the pale freckles across her nose stood out like small constellations against winter skin. She moved with the controlled speed of someone who'd once learned the cost of being careless. An old lesson that lived in her posture, not her mouth. Frank Miller followed because his body refused to do anything else. Sheriff Thompson had told him to remain by the cabin, to let law enforcement do its job. But Frank had watched too many men disappear into bad terrain while others waited behind a line. The waiting had never healed anyone. The waiting had only grown stories that woke you up at night. He stayed several steps back, hands visible, his breath measured. His boots cut a steady rhythm through the snow, crunch, 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 like a metronome that kept him from thinking too hard. The puppies, meanwhile, pulled the whole group forward with a fierce little certainty. The biggest pup forged ahead, nose down, tail stiff as a flag. The middle pup zigzagged, pausing to sniff low branches and the base of trees, then trotting again with purposeful urgency. The smallest pup stayed slightly behind the other 2, but her eyes were bright, her ears forward. She was frightened, yes, but her fear had become fuel. Every few yards, one of them barked sharply. Not random noise, but a signal, like a tiny soldier calling, "This way," without knowing the words. Sarah glanced back at Frank once, briefly. "Mr. Miller," she called over the wind. "Stay behind the line, please." Frank nodded. He did not argue. He simply kept moving, because he knew something Sarah didn't. A man who had learned to survive chaos could also help keep it from spreading. The forest deepened. Pine and spruce crowded in. Snow lay knee-high in places, hiding rocks and fallen branches like traps covered in sugar. The wind cut through gaps in the trees and slapped faces with icy hands. Radios crackled with coded updates, small bursts of noise swallowed by the wilderness. A new deputy stepped into Frank's peripheral vision. A tall, wiry man with a narrow face and tired eyes, his dark hair tucked beneath a fur-lined cap. His name patch read, Deputy Luis Ortega. He looked early 40s, with the guarded patience of someone who'd worked too many winters and too many long shifts. His skin was a warm olive tone, his jaw clean-shaven, and his mouth held a permanent line like he'd learned not to waste expressions. When he spoke, it was low and calm. "Watch your footing," he murmured to Frank as they climbed a small rise. "This snow hides more than cold." Frank gave him a brief look of gratitude, 2 men acknowledging each other without needing conversation. Ortega stayed on Frank's side after that, not as a guard, but as a quiet anchor. The puppies abruptly stopped near a cluster of spruce, their bodies going from motion to statue in an instant. The biggest pup growled low, the sound vibrating in his tiny chest like a warning bell. The middle pup pawed at the snow near the base of a tree, then sniffed hard and barked once, short, commanding. The smallest pup backed a step, then leaned forward again, trembling with tension, not weakness. Sheriff Thompson raised his fist, and the line froze. Silence dropped over the group like a heavy blanket. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. From somewhere ahead, down a narrow dip between trees, came a faint sound. A scrape, too deliberate to be falling snow, too heavy to be a squirrel. Frank's heart tightened, not with panic, but with recognition. He knew that sound. A human trying to move without being seen. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Her hand hovered closer to her holster now, but she didn't draw. She waited. She listened. The scar on her chin caught a stray flash of light as she tilted her head, tracking the noise with her whole body. The puppies crept forward another foot, then stopped again at the edge of a shallow ravine. The snow there sloped downward, and the trees grew tighter, branches knitting together overhead like ribs. The biggest pup stood with his paws planted at the lip of the drop, head lowered, gaze locked downward. The middle pup's ears were up, rigid. The smallest pup pressed close to Frank's boot, as if she needed to borrow courage from leather and warmth. "Sheriff?" Sarah whispered, not turning her head. "They're pointing." Sheriff Thompson stepped forward carefully, one hand raised to keep the deputies still. His breath fogged thick in the air. "Suspect!" he called, voice firm, amplified by the ravine's hollow. "County Sheriff's Department, show your hands!" For a heartbeat, nothing answered. Then a shape moved below, dark against white, stumbling into view like a wounded animal forced into light. The man was gaunt, mid-30s maybe, with cheeks hollowed by hunger and fear. His jacket was torn, the fabric soaked in places with old, dark stains. One arm was wrapped in a blood-stained cloth, and his breath came in harsh bursts. His hair was matted under a hood, and his eyes darted wildly, scanning for exits that weren't there. He tried to climb the opposite slope, boots slipping in powder, desperation making him clumsy. But the slope was steep, the snow was deep, and he was hurt. Sheriff Thompson's deputies raised their weapons, not pointing wildly, but steady, controlled. Sarah's posture tightened into a precise stillness, the way a bow tightens before release. Frank felt something inside him shift, an old switch flicking on. Not aggression, not heroics, just a cold, clear understanding that this moment could snap in either direction. The man below was cornered. Cornered things bit. Frank stepped forward half a step, enough that his voice could carry down without becoming a shout. Sheriff Thompson flicked him a sharp glance, warning, but Frank didn't push past the line. He simply spoke. "Listen," Frank called, tone low, steady, the voice of someone who had commanded in worse storms than this. "You're bleeding, you're freezing, and you're out of room." He paused, letting the words land like stones. "Don't do something stupid. Put it down." The suspect's eyes jerked toward Frank. For a second, the man looked confused, as if he hadn't expected a civilian voice, and certainly not one that sounded like authority without a badge. His hand shifted under his torn jacket. A glint appeared, metal, partially hidden. Sarah's grip tightened. Ortega's breath hissed quietly beside Frank, controlled, ready. Frank kept his hands visible. He didn't advance. He didn't threaten. He simply held the man with his voice, the way you held a frightened horse. Not by force, but by calm. You can live through this, Frank said, quieter now, as if speaking only to him. But only if you stop fighting the cold and start listening. The suspect's shoulders trembled. Not bravado, not anger, pure exhaustion. His fingers loosened. A handgun slid from beneath his jacket and dropped into the snow with a dull, muffled thump. The sound was small, almost pathetic, but the relief it sparked was enormous, like the forest itself exhaled. Sheriff Thompson's voice snapped back into command. "On your knees! Hands behind your head! Do it now!" The man obeyed, slowly, shakily, then collapsed into the snow as if his bones had finally admitted defeat. Deputies moved in with practiced speed, securing him, cuffing him, retrieving the weapon. Sarah kept her eyes on the suspect's hands until the last possible second, then flicked her gaze to Frank, an unreadable look that held something like respect and something like disbelief. The puppies barked once more, sharp and victorious, then went quiet. The biggest pup trotted to Frank's side, chest puffed out as if he'd personally won the war. The smallest pup pressed against Frank's boot again, trembling now with adrenaline rather than fear. The middle pup sat, head tilted, watching the deputies work as if he were checking the world for leftover danger. Sheriff Thompson turned toward Frank, breath heavy, eyes hard but not unkind. "You got lucky," he said. "And you stayed calm." His gaze dropped to the puppies. "All of you did." Frank looked down at the three little bodies, snow-dusted and bright-eyed, and felt a strange warmth spread beneath his ribs. Something that wasn't victory, but purpose. The storm had delivered them to his porch, and now in the pale winter light, they had delivered the storm back to the law. A happy ending. 3 small warriors find a home. The forest didn't cheer when the handcuffs clicked. It simply went quiet again, as if the pines were satisfied the wrong note had been removed from their song. Deputies moved with brisk efficiency, securing the suspect and retrieving what he'd tried to carry like a secret: cash wrapped in damp bands, a weapon half buried in snow, the ugly evidence of a night that could have ended worse. Sheriff Jake Thompson's voice tightened into radio codes and short commands, his breath rolling out in pale clouds. Deputy Sarah Collins stayed steady, eyes sharp until the very last moment, as if she didn't fully trust relief. Deputy Luis Ortega watched the tree line while others worked, his posture still guarding the world from surprises, the way some men never stop guarding, even when the danger is already on its knees. Frank Miller stood at the edge of the ravine, hands empty, shoulders heavy, feeling the aftershock settle into his bones. The adrenaline drained and left behind a familiar hollow, quiet, cold, and too honest. He looked down at the 3 puppies as they circled his boots in tight, proud loops, tails whipping like tiny flags. The biggest pup bounced once, twice, then planted himself as if he were the one in charge of crowd control. The middle pup sat and watched the deputies with a measured calm that didn't match his age. The smallest pup, still trembling slightly, pressed close to Frank's leg, as though she needed to confirm the earth was stable again. In that moment, Frank realized something with a strange tenderness. They had followed him into danger, the way soldiers followed each other, because fear was real, and still not enough to make them abandon the one they'd chosen. Sheriff Thompson walked back up the slope with careful steps, snow sliding from his boots. Up close, the sheriff looked older than his authority suggested. Fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a weariness under the beard that winter couldn't create. He stopped in front of Frank and nodded once, the nod of a man who didn't hand out praise lightly. "Mr. Miller," Thompson said, voice rough with cold. "If those pups hadn't led us, we might have lost the trail in the storm." We were close to calling it and waiting for daylight. But daylight would have given him time. Frank didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the puppies again, as if trying to understand how something so small could carry so much weight. Sarah stepped up beside the sheriff, brushing snow from her gloves. In the pale light, her freckles and the faint scar at her chin looked less like toughness and more like proof of survival. She crouched slightly and let the smallest pup sniff her knuckles. The pup hesitated, then offered a quick lick, as if approving the deputy's presence. Sarah's mouth tilted into a brief smile. Small, surprised, genuine. They moved like a scout unit, she said, half to Frank, half to herself. No hesitation, no confusion. Like they were trained. Frank gave a short, humorless exhale that almost became a laugh. They're babies, he said. But, yeah, felt like they knew what they were doing. Sheriff Thompson's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. We'll figure out where they came from, he said. But whatever happened, you did the right thing taking them in. Those words, you did the right thing, landed in Frank's chest like warmth. He'd heard versions of it before in other contexts, spoken over folded flags and in dim rooms with coffee that tasted like ash. But hearing it now, in the open air, with 3 living creatures leaning into him, felt different. Less like condolence, more like permission. The deputies began moving back toward the cabin, escorting the suspect between them. The man kept his head down, shoulders hunched. The fight drained out of him, leaving only shivering. Ortega walked slightly behind, steady and watchful. The group traveled through snow like a procession returning from a harsh altar. When they reached Frank's clearing, the police vehicles still sat on the narrow track, lights now dimmer, urgency softened into procedure. A few officers worked near the porch, marking the lifted board, bagging the blood-stained cloth and the key fob with R.K., as if they were collecting pieces of a broken story. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow into a field of diamonds that didn't care who deserved beauty and who didn't. Frank's cabin looked different with patrol cars in front of it, smaller, exposed, less like a fortress of solitude and more like a place that could be found. Sarah handed Frank a cup of coffee from a thermos one of the deputies carried. The smell rose warm and bitter, grounding. You're shaking, she said quietly, not accusing, just noticing. Frank glanced down at his hands and realized she was right. He hadn't felt it until she pointed it out. Adrenaline, he murmured, taking the cup. Old habit. Sarah nodded once, as if she understood more than she wanted to admit. Same, she said, and for a second her guardedness softened. When it's over, that's when your body remembers to react. Sheriff Thompson approached again, less commanding now, more human. We'll need a statement, he said. Not right this second, but soon. This case is going to get questions in town. Frank nodded. I'll answer. Thompson looked down at the puppies, who had begun investigating the officers with bold curiosity, sniffing boots and pant legs like tiny inspectors. The biggest pup puffed his chest at a deputy twice his size and barked once, an absurd, brave sound that made 2 officers chuckle despite themselves. Sarah's laugh slipped out too, brief, bright, almost embarrassed. He thinks he's a canine already, she said. Frank surprised himself then. He laughed. Not loud, not long, but real. A sound that came from somewhere behind the armor. It warmed the air between them in a way the sun couldn't. The puppies responded immediately, tails whipping harder, as if they'd been waiting for that sound all night and were relieved it still existed inside him. Sheriff Thompson's expression softened. "Department policy is to bring strays to the station," he said carefully. "We'll check for reports, scan for chips, see if anyone's looking for them." Frank felt the puppies press against his legs, 3 warm points of contact that suddenly mattered more than he expected. He looked at their faces, at the biggest one's stubborn bravery, the middle one's steady gaze, the smallest one's trembling loyalty. And something inside him made a decision before his mouth did. "They can check," Frank said. He paused, then added, voice firm, "But they're coming back here." Sarah looked up. "You want to keep them?" Her tone was gentle, but there was a careful curiosity beneath it, like she was trying not to scare the answer away. Frank reached down and ran his hand over 3 small heads, feeling soft fur and the quick rhythm of life. "Yeah," he said simply. "I do." Sheriff Thompson studied Frank for a moment, measuring him the way seasoned men measured storms. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll do it the right way. Temporary hold, paperwork, then we'll see." Frank looked at the puppies again and realized the cabin was not silent anymore. Not truly. Even when they weren't barking, their presence filled the room to come with breath, with tiny footsteps, with mischief and need. He rested his palm on the biggest pup's head. "You need names," he murmured. Sarah's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Already naming them?" she teased, and there was warmth in it now. Frank glanced at her, then at the sheriff, then back down at the 3 small warriors. A soldier's humor rose up. Dry, simple, a way to make the heavy things lighter without lying about their weight. "Ace," he said, tapping the biggest pup gently, "because he thinks he runs the mission." The biggest pup barked once, as if approving. Frank touched the middle pup's head. "Ranger," he said, "because he's the one who actually knew the route." Then he crouched to the smallest pup, who leaned into his glove like she'd been waiting to belong to a hand. Frank's voice softened. "And you, Hope," he whispered, "because you showed up anyway." Sarah's eyes flickered, and for a second she looked away toward the trees, as if the word had struck something tender. Sheriff Thompson cleared his throat, the sound rough, like he was swallowing his own emotion. "Good names," the sheriff said quietly. By late afternoon, the police vehicles began to pull away. The flashing lights vanished down the track, leaving behind rutted snow and a world that was returning to normal. Its quiet not empty anymore, but earned. Frank stood on his porch with Ace, Ranger, and Hope pressed against his boots like a promise. Inside, the stove still held warmth. The quilt still lay on the floor. And the cabin, once a museum of memories he refused to dust, now felt like a home that expected him to live in it. That night, when Frank poured warm milk into a shallow bowl and watched 3 tails wag in unison, he understood the twist fate had played. The storm had tried to take their lives, and instead, it had delivered him back to his own. In the end, Frank didn't just open a door to 3 freezing puppies. He opened a door to a kind of mercy that only heaven can deliver on the coldest nights. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was timing. Or maybe God still sends small messengers when a heart is ready to be softened again. Ace, Ranger, and Hope didn't arrive with answers. They arrived with a chance. One more chance for a tired soul to choose love over fear, and light over loneliness. And that's the miracle hiding in everyday life. It rarely looks like thunder or gold. Sometimes it looks like paw prints in fresh snow. Sometimes it sounds like a quiet scratch at your door. And sometimes it's God whispering, "Not yet. You still have purpose. You still have someone to save. and someone to be saved by. If this story touched you, take a moment to look around your own life today. Who might need warmth, a kind word, a little patience, a second chance? You never know. What you call ordinary might be where God places the next miracle. Please share this story with someone who needs hope. Comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced a moment that felt like God's timing. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and unexpected blessings. May God bless you and your family, keep you safe, and fill your days with peace, even when life feels like a storm. Amen.